So just bringing this up again, going to the index.js. It's our top level. We didn't do anything really there. It's an app, and the app is our main entry point. So there's the app, which has just a router. And so really what we want is inside the example, we have a router, and it has these two routes, right? So that's going to be taking whatever this URL is and determining what page to display, either the home page or the list page. And then those pages are here. We did a base page there. So there's our home page. The list page has a lot more on it. Well, because it has a to-do list. So if we go over here and look at our list, we've got our test list and new things happen here, right? And I'll go ahead and pop that up in case we need to debug some stuff. Yeah, that's a material UI thing. All right, and I'll go ahead and split that in case I need a window there. All right, so I guess the next thing we could do is we can look at maybe adding a second list. So in our list page, we've got items is being added here. So we could have a list of lists, right? So that's one of the things that I'm going to do is now, well, one of the things to kind of get in that direction is I want to actually go into our routes here, and I'm going to have a lists page, and then I'll have a list page, which will be list slash list ID. All right. Well, that makes sense so far?
Yeah, real quick, before we get into it too much, I was hoping we could talk about Lodash a little bit more and FP.
Okay. Sure.
If that doesn't derail things.
So Lodash has two ways of working with it. There's kind of the really nice, well-documented way, and then there's the way that we use.
Right.
Of course.
So basically,
yeah.
Yeah, let me see if there's.
I spent about an hour yesterday trying to figure out the documentation on FP pipe, which doesn't exist in Lodash because it changed to Flow.
Oh. Oops. Yeah, pipe is an alias of Flow. Sorry.
And just trying to figure out how to use that in, I guess, in the console so that I could see what's happening. That's kind of the problem is like I'm having to write the JavaScript and then render it and then just see how it acts. And when it's not working, it's kind of hard to debug. So I didn't know if you had some way of doing that better than I.
So I have not had the best of luck trying to do like Lodashy things in the console. There may be ways of doing that, but importing modules is not something like importing modules with ES6 syntax like we're doing here is not something that works well with the developer tools.
Right.
Because the developer tools give you kind of a dumbed down version that doesn't have all of the variables. And so you'll sometimes notice that even if you've got a breakpoint somewhere, like, you see, do we have anything on our, maybe in our components? Where do we use actual Lodash?
Maybe in the routes, something like that.
We might have gotten rid of it. Okay, so we got it on the list page.
FP.
Oh, right. Oh, in this case, it's just doing a remove.
Okay, well, for that example.
But, okay, so.
What's happening in there?
Sorry, that's Python. Yeah. And this is going to be broken because my router didn't get updated. I was halfway here.
All right.
Okay. We start deleting something on the debugger here, right? So it does manage to render it for us, and we can look at things like the ID is 1. Problem is that FP is undefined. Right, so that
Right.
module that we imported is not quite going to be available to us. That's the downside of doing anything on the debugger like that interactive.
Yeah. So Lodash was defined, the underscore in TCPA. I don't know if we're doing that in the head of the base page or something.
Like the actual underscore works?
Yeah.
I did not know. I don't know how that's working.
Yeah,
maybe
so
it just defines window dot underscore.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Looks like Lodash
yeah,
inserts itself onto the window.
I've been using
cute.
Lodash and then having to swap all the values because FP is the opposite.
Right. So FP is built around composing things. So it really wants you to be, well, and here it says rearranged arguments. So it really wants you to use these things in either a flow or a pipe. That's really how it's designed. And the idea is I'm going to give you a partial function. So if I just say, well, if we look at remove as an example, where was that here? Okay. So remove right here is saying, here's the function to tell you what to remove. And here's the sequence to apply that function over, right? So it'll give you a new...
What is IT?
It is a parameter to a function. So if I want to rewrite this more verbosely, I can say let new items equals fp.remove function IT.
Okay.
Return it.id is equal to ID. And then the second argument here is items.
So right? IT is items?
IT is an individual item in the items array.
So it's doing, it's iterating over items and passing each one in as IT.
Yes.
Okay. See, these are the little details that docs leave out.
Yeah, so when you see something like predicate, that's a function that you're going to call on each item from this array. And that's how it's going to document that. So it's a predicate function because it's a function that returns true or false. That's just kind of the nomenclature there.
Okay.
So, and in this case, it's going to be removes elements from array that predicate returns truthy for, and returns an array of the removed elements. So, and then you can kind of ignore this note because this isn't true for FP. FP doesn't mutate things in place. And that's one of the nice things about it, I guess. It's going to give you a new array that is missing those items. So, right, so that's what's happening here, is we're getting a new list. But what if we just wanted to have a function which would remove anything whose ID was ID, right? And then later on, you could apply that function to something else. So you could have also written this. I'm going to go back to the other syntax because it's a little shorter there. So I could have done this as let's call it temp0 equals fp.remove it gets it.id is equal to ID. Okay, so now temp0 is a function that you can apply to items. Okay, so that's functionally doing the same thing as what's going on below, right? So if you call one of these FP versions of the Lodash with not enough arguments, what it does is it gives you a partially bound function. So it's kind of filling in some of the parameters and giving you a function which takes the rest of them. Does that make sense?
I see. Yeah, so that was kind of my next question, is that I saw that pipe was having a function, having something passed in like it was a function, and I didn't understand how that was working. It had in TCPA, it was passing the forms into it to process them.
So here, what Flow does is it builds a new function, which is going to call the list of functions that you've given it on that. So if we said, well, here's just an example of adding and squaring. So here's a function square, and then here's add square is going, well, that's a bad example because you're almost always dealing with sequences with Lodash. That's why you use it, because it makes it easy to operate on these arrays. Lodash is kind of what we do because we don't have list comprehension. So let's see if I go in.
Right. It's just not clear how, when you do a pipe or a flow, how the values are getting passed between the functions.
Okay,
so how do I know what's coming out of one and going into the next?
So let me show you. Let's say we had step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, things like that. So I'll say it goes to I don't know. I'm making stuff up, obviously. And then we've got some sequence. Something like that. And then I do a, I'll call it a pipeline. And this is going to be fp.flow or fp.pipe. I like pipe because I'm used to using pipes. And so actually I won't put this on multiple lines. I'll just say step 1, step 2, step 3. And then I can say new values is equal to pipeline of my values. And what this is going to do, this code right here, I guess these two lines, are equivalent to saying, oh, sorry. I should have made this, these maps, because that makes it a little bit clearer, I think. So a map just means call the function that you give this on every item that's passed into it. So these are partial functions, right? This step 1, step 2, and step 3 are now functions which can be called on a sequence, because we've run fp.map on them. Okay. So what this is really doing is it's saying step 1 on my values. Let T1 is step 2 on my value, or sorry, step 2 on T0. T3 is step 3 on T1. Sorry, I should call this, well, let me just change these so that the numbers line up, right? And new values is T3, right? So that's what's happening. You pass step 1, the original sequence, that gives you a new sequence T1.
So you take the new array with the result.
Yes. Okay. And then that array is passed to step 2. And then that generates a new array T3, or sorry, T2, which is then passed to step 3. Okay, so that's what, and so the way that I would actually write this, like in the wild, would probably be closer to new values is fp.pipe, fp.map, it is it times 2, fp.map, and then I'll just do that all in one quote unquote line, right? I spread it out over multiple lines, but that's the idea, is we're taking new value or my values and we're calling this map on it to get a new array, and that gives us a temporary. That array is passed to this map, and then that array is passed to this map. So it's a lot like a pipeline on the command line. So if you put the pipe symbol in between, I guess the difference from a pipeline is this computes all the intermediate values at once. It's not truly flowing the data through like a Unix pipeline would, like one element at a time. It's doing the batch, and then it's passing that batch on to the next element.
Yeah, I think the key for me here is that in the docs, like if you look at any of them, they'll have, well, not flow, but if you look at like map in the docs, it'll show like a collection being passed in, right?
So exactly.
And you don't have to do that anymore in the pipe, which was what was throwing me, because it's treating them, it's just passing in the output of the previous one as the collection automatically.
Right. So the way that, and that's that whole partial binding thing that low-fp does. So it flips these arguments to map. It puts the function as the first argument. And the reason for that is you would almost never want to say, call any function on this one given collection, right? That's not as useful as saying, call this function on any collection that I give you, right? So that's why it switches those. And the only direction that it's ever going to bind them is left to right. So it partially fills them in left to right. So it flips those. And then if you only call it with one argument, then it gives you something that will map any collection, onto that function. So yeah, and those are the main differences that we see here. So here's mapping. So if we did _.map, say that on %, then you'd actually switch that for doing the map of %. So map takes this value and then calls it on this sequence. So you could either call it like this, or you could actually call map with both % and the sequence as 2 arguments.
Right, which is, so I've been doing it as 2 arguments because I didn't know you could do it the other way.
Well, I think doing it with 2 arguments makes more sense to me, if that's something that's possible.
Right, but then when I don't see 2 arguments in the pipe code, I'm very confused. So
that makes sense why you would be confused.
Yeah, okay.
Well, and so another thing that you might do is, let's say we had let's see. So we had some object, and it's got, K0 is 1, 2, 3, or 1, 2, 3, yeah. K1 is 4, 5, 6. K2 is 7, 8, 9, right? And what I want to have is y equal to K0 is 6, K1 is 15. Sorry, K1 is 15, and K2 is 24. Did I get the math right? I'm trying to sum those.
Yeah.
Okay. So how do we get from X to Y? In Python, we would do this by saying, Y equals the key and the sum of the values for K and values in X.items, right? So we have this nice syntax to be able to do something like that. We can't do that in JavaScript yet. So what we've got to do instead is this weird FP thing. So what I would do is I would say fp.pipe, actually, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to say fp.toPairs. And what that does is if we go over here, it takes an object and it gives you a sequence of key value pairs. So that's like our dot items. Right, so we now have, and then what we want to do is we want to say fp.map, and I'll just use it for right now. I'm gonna make this a little bit bigger than normal, and I'll clean it up a little bit. But so let's key and values equals it, and then return. I don't even know how to do that in JavaScript. Is there a sum? Nope.
Maybe math thoughts. Isn't there like a math or something like that?
Here,
saying reduce. Google
oh, there we go. There's one in. To me, Lodash is almost like the missing parts of JavaScript.
Right, which are helpers.
Yeah, so I could just say fp.sum of those values. But I don't want to just return that. I want to actually return the key and that sum. And then after the map, I want to say fp.toPairs. And I can call that on my X object. So what this is going to do is it's going to take, two pairs, takes an object as its input, and it gives you the key value pairs. Right?
It would be an array of
two items, or it's an array of arrays.
Yeah.
Right? An array of two item arrays.
Yeah.
So
array of pairs. Yeah.
Yes, an array of pairs. And then for each one of those pairs, which I'm calling IT right here, I'm splitting it out into its two components right there with this let statement. It's deconstructing it. And then I am summing up the values. And then I still need to have the key and the value pairs, because then I'm going to do two pairs, which is the opposite of from pairs, right? It builds an object out of a sequence of key value pairs.
But you're doing two pairs, two pairs.
Oh, sorry.
From pairs.
It should be from pairs, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I see.
So
that will recreate.
That recreates the object.
Object, yeah.
Yeah. And so then that gives you something that looks like this. So, and then if I wanted to make this more succinct, which I often will, it does get a little hard to read sometimes, but an equivalent to what I have there would be to say fp.map. And instead of saying IT right there, I can actually say key and values. And that goes to key and fp.sum values. That's, and I know I do really cryptic things sometimes, but even that this is making my cryptic meter get a little bit heavy. So, but if you see something like this, what this is doing is that, anytime you see this arrow, it means that there's a function being created. And that function takes one argument. That argument is an array, and it has two items, key and values. So we're kind of doing all that deconstruction right there in the argument list. And then if you ever see something that goes here and it just has a single expression on the right-hand side, this means return this expression from the function. So we don't have to explicitly say return. And so here it returns the key and the sum of the values, and we don't need that extra I there. But that's what's going on there if you see something like that.
Okay.
All right?
Yep. I get it.
Cool.
Cool.
So Lodash is kind of magical and kind of neat, I think, but yeah, it takes some getting used to. I would recommend kind of looking through some of these examples in the Lodash FP page. Now there's maybe a handful of these that we use a lot. We use map, of course, quite a bit. Filter, find, remove. Those are the main ones. There's also some functions inside Lodash, like map. Like if you look at the cool, awesome docs, it says, here is your iterate, which is a function, and the function actually takes multiple arguments inside Yeah, here it is. It's invoked with 3 arguments: the value, the index, and the collection. Right, so that's what this function is being called with in regular Lodash. But that's not what happens inside Lodash-FP. That's when it's saying here, capped iterate arguments. So the function that you're calling actually just takes a single argument.
Mm.
So in Lodash, you can do some interesting things if you know the index and you know the collection that it came from. But in FP, you're kind of restricted. And that's just, it works better with the currying. And currying is just partially creating these functions, like one piece at a time, one argument at a time.
When it says that under identity, what is identity?
Identity just means return each item from the collection. So identity is, I can say, if I say Z is identity of W, then Z is going to be equal to W. It's just a function that returns its argument.
Okay.
And that's the default. If you don't provide one there, then it will just give you each item from the collection, which doesn't seem useful, but there may be some use cases that I don't know. I guess if there's going to be a default, it's the best default to choose, the one that does nothing.
Okay.
All right. So yeah, that's a little bit of Lodash FP.
That's a good amount.
Okay. But then the lists, we want to get to the lists page. So let me go ahead and actually I'll copy this. Wait. There we go. Yeah, so lists page. And so this is where we get kind of a little bit weird, because it's like, how are we going to store these lists? So I'm going to use an object to store them. And actually, let's start off with something so that it's got something to display here. And I'll go ahead and give it some items as well. Actually, let's not do an object. Let's do a list, because I'm going to give them string names. Just actually, how about I just give them name? Oops, there we go. Okay. I guess the downside here is let's just not worry about the case of duplicate lists, because that makes it a little bit more complicated. Normally an API will probably be telling us these things, but we'll go ahead and go with this. So the name, and then its items is going to be an empty list there. And delete list takes an ID, well, it takes a name as well. Well, how do I do this? Now that's going to remove all of the lists that have the name that we're looking for. So if we have duplicate lists and then we try to remove one, it's going to remove everyone that has that name. We'll still need add item and delete item, but now we've got to have a list. And yeah, there is a problem here. Let me just see if there's any kind of a UUID. Yeah, that's ugly. Kind of wish that there was an easier way to just generate random keys. Okay. So how about we do this for keys instead? We'll kind of thinking through this out loud as well. So give it a name. We'll also give it an ID, which is going to be math.random. So everything's going to have these random numbers as their keys. That'll help us a little bit to have unique IDs everywhere. Remember there. And now we're not going to delete things by name. We'll delete them by their ID. And so adding an item to the list, the ID is also going to be math. Oops. Sorry. So we actually here need to do a little bit more. We need to say the, actually, it's going to be the fp.find, not filled, find, where the list idea is that on the lists. So we got to first find the list, then we've got to add the item to it, right? So we create the new version of that list, and then set lists to be, well, actually this is even, okay, yeah. So what we're going to do here is we're going to map. Is this right? Yeah, this is getting pretty ugly in terms of how we would do it. Is there a replace? Not for lists. Okay. So splicing back together, actually, is there a slice? There is. Yeah, I don't know that that's really what we want though. Yeah, adding individual items to the list starts to get a little bit more difficult here. And I'm going to go back and change my mind again on this. I'm going to make this into an object because that ends up cleaning things up a lot for us. So the ID is going to be the key here. Am I going to change my mind again? I'm going to change my mind again. I'm going to leave it there. So maybe the best way to do this is just to, remove the list from our lists there. Sorry. And what we're going to do here is we're going to say new lists and the list that we just created. Okay, so we find the list that we're interested in, we modify it, we then create the new lists without the list that we're modifying, and then we add it back in, which is a lot of work to get it, you know, back in and working, but it's at least gotten us where we wanted to be. And there's a different way that we can structure our state to make that work a little bit better. And then our list ID is going to, we'll call this item ID here. It's going to be kind of similar. So grab our list there. And we are going to remove that item. Okay, I guess we're calling this sorry, I'm okay. So let me go back up here and think about this add item. So we find the list, we don't want to do this. We want to do actually the list, whoops, dot values, because that, or sorry, dot items is going to be the old list dot items, followed by the new item that we just added. And then that should do that. So now our list is going to be the same thing here. We're going to, we're changing the dot items. List dot items there. And then we will replace the list here. Okay. And we'll say, oh, I'm going to make this let's see, if we looked at our to-do list, it was lists with list items, list item text. Okay. So we're going to map our lists onto, how about a list entry? We'll call it a list entry there. So on add is going to be now a value which goes to add item list and that value, because we're binding that to that particular list. And then on delete is going to be an ID goes to delete item, sorry. Okay. So look at that, and if, you know, think about that. If there's questions on that, I can handle some of those. Actually, you know what? We don't even need the on add and on delete. I've done, or are we going to need it? Just thinking through this. This is actually getting a little bit ugly. So this is if we're going to be showing all of the lists on one page, then that becomes difficult for us to manage. So we're going to actually have to lift this up to some higher level thing. So let's just assume that we're showing all the lists on one page for now, rather than having this be on separate pages, because that does introduce us, all sorts of issues of managing the multiple lists. So let's just go ahead and say to-do list and the list, or sorry, items. Okay. This is actually very close to what we want right there. And I need to close paren right there. Okay, so that's our lists page. And do we have that in our router? We don't. Okay, cool. So lists was a list, yeah. And I guess we need to have some kind of a text field, not test field. Well, here, I'll do a form. Actually, we'll change this add list. We need a little bit more state here. And then for add list, we won't take the name. We'll just grab it from here. Or I don't even have to do that. I just have to say here the name and then set list name to be empty string. And we should probably do something here to separate these lists. So let me just put them like that. And I need another close paren. Did I get my first list a name? I did. Why isn't it showing my name? because I'm not showing that page. There we go. Awesome. Now I'm showing nothing at all. Let me see. Items. Yeah. Okay, that's the new list, but why isn't it showing any of my items? Oh, because I need to actually call map on something. Hey. We now actually have something there. And I'm gonna do one more thing. Make that a function. Or actually, do I just say, look at my, oh yeah, it's just delete. Okay, so deleting the list hopefully makes it go away. Yay. That's a problem. And whenever you see something like that, it means that it's passing in an object and trying to render it as a string. So it is oh, right, I need to, this actually takes an event. And what we need to do is set list name ev.target.value. And you could have found that out on the material UI page if you look at the examples for the okay. And this is what happens when you forget to do a cancel default on your submits. So on submit, that event needs to be canceled. Otherwise, it's going to refresh your page, which is not what we want. Okay. Creating new list, deleting existing list, list 0, learn React. And now we have multiple lists on one page.
Cool.
So, yeah. So there we go. That's multiple lists on one page. There's a couple of problems still with this. If we wanted to split this up over multiple pages, what we've got to do now is we've got to figure out where we're going to store the state, right? And the only place that we could store the state is in kind of a global level. Since we're doing all of this on the client, right? We could either, maybe we could put it in local storage. That's something where the browser has a place where you can store some data. Or you could put it in a global variable. You could drop it, you could put it on the window object, but you're making it kind of not React-y anymore. It's not really acting like state. React has this concept called context that we could use potentially, and it's another component that basically provides kind of a container for the shared state. What we'll actually do, and I don't think that it's a good idea to try to introduce Redux at this point, but I think that Redux is a good example of a place where we could do this. What it might do, though, is rearrange the state just a little bit to make it closer to what we might do with Redux. So we'll stay with this single page app here, but I'm going to change the way that these things look a little bit. So let me just do this. Make my state, how about this? And we're going to have lists, which is going to be an empty list. And let's see, I'm trying to think if that's actually, yeah, and then we'll just do objects. So this is going to be very weird looking at first. I'm not sure why it's complaining about that. Oh, because you can't do equals. So the idea is this is going to actually, let's make this list IDs. So we're going to be storing just IDs, and then every actual object is going to be an entry in our objects area here. So when I do an add list, what I really want to do is create a new list. And that's going to be, the ID is math.random. The name is list name, item, and I'm going to make this item IDs is an empty list right there. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say set state, and say the list IDs is going to be state.list IDs and the new list.id, right? Whoop, that's not what I want to do. There we go. And then objects is going to be objects. And then this syntax right here lets me say, have a value as a key. So like a computed value. So my new list.id becomes the key there. And the new list is the value. And I'm changing the shape of my state there. Right, so list IDs is going to be just a list of list IDs. My objects are going to be looking like something like that. For deleting a list, this one, I could actually just say, let new list IDs be fp.remove. Or sorry, I'll just say technically I could go with just that, but I also want to, drop it from the objects. Dropping it from the objects is a little bit trickier because we're going to have to do that FP jazz there. So we'll actually say let new objects equals fp.pipe, or I'll do flow just to, so fp.toPairs, fp.remove, and I'll just say, do this in this way. So const key and value is it, return key is equal to ID, and then fp.fromPairs. And what we're going to do now is we're going to set state to be list IDs is new list IDs, and objects is new objects. Removing is always a little bit harder than adding it in. So if we wanted to be sloppy, we could skip this step. right, and just leave it in their objects array. It would leak memory. Basically, that list would never actually get cleaned up. It would still exist in memory. We would just never be able to access it. But we're not going to do that now. We'll be good and clean up after ourselves. Adding an item now is a little bit easier. So all that we need to do here, so the list is actually just going to be objects dot objects for the list ID. Right, we can look it up directly in the objects, so that gets quicker. The list items, that's going to be the same idea, except what we're going to do is let new item equals ID is math.random, and the value there. And list.item IDs is going to be list.item IDs and new item.id. Right? And now what we can do is we can say set state. We don't change the list IDs. For the objects, we want to make sure that it's got the old objects. And technically, you know, we've mutated the list in place. That's not a great idea. I'm going to go ahead and say the list ID is going to be replacing the list. And then we're also going to say the new item.id is the new item. Okay, so that's just mutating the objects. Oh, and we want to leave the rest of the state alone. So what we can do is we can just say, introduce the rest of the state right there, and then only our overrides come later. And then deleting an item, same basic idea. We're going to, actually, I'll just copy all of this because it's very similar to what we were doing before. Actually. Oh, wait, sorry. So to remove the reference to that item from that list, all that we need to do is we need to run remove on it. And so since this is just item IDs, we can pop it right out right there. And then to remove it from the state there, we'll have to do the same little removal that we did here. And this is where you might want to think about making a little function to remove something from the state, or to remove an object by its ID. Because really, oh, sorry. In this case, that takes ID as its value. That takes ID as its value. And that's pretty much it. Well, we don't need that anymore. So actually, we just need this to be new objects. This is going to break. Just, you know, I know it's going to break because I did too much coding without checking in general, but also because, let's see what's going on there. Oh. The word is let. Oh, and yeah, this needs to be state dot objects. This is item ID. Right. Oh. This is actually going to be on state.objects. And here we're going to do state.list IDs. That's what we're mapping this over. And the items, this is actually a little bit more difficult to deal with here. So let's just say lists there. And I'll say const lists equals. I want to start off with the list IDs. So I'm going to start this off with state.list IDs. And I want to actually map that a list ID becomes state.objects list ID. And then I also want to make sure that the items of the list are populated. So I'm going to do fp.map of the list becomes list, and the items is going to be fp.map. Oh, and this needs a extra parentheses here.
Closer.
Yeah, closer.
Hey.
Okay. So did we start this off? It doesn't have any lists. So let's see, my list. And of course that breaks. Items.map. So one of the things that we could do here is just say, look at what we're actually generating there. So running the list, that's right. So now let's scroll back up here and see what it thinks it's rendering. Okay, so we were trying to build something that looked like, items is a function. So we looked up the items, or the list, okay, but the items was wrong because we actually need to map this over the list's item IDs. Always good to add little print statements effectively.
Console or print?
Well, console in the case of JavaScript, but it's the equivalent of printing. Yeah, so we've got a, apparently it's when I was deleting lists, it didn't clean them up out of the objects properly. So wonder, yeah, without is on arrays. Just check and see if there's anything for objects, like a remove, omits. Let's try, instead of doing this like this, let's say, Oh, except that's not where I wanted to do that. It was on delete list. And the path is going to just be the key there. So this is the list ID out of, oh, well, that's one problem. This ID was being passed into this flow, which was wrong. So it turns out that we do have a little function that's already existing for us. There we go. And then one other thing that it was warning us about, I might as well go ahead and fix that here. And that is we're supposed to have a unique key for each one of these. So here I'll say the key is equal to list.id. Okay. And still something is happening on deleting lists. I guess and one other thing that would be useful here is showing what the state is. Okay, so let's just create a list and then delete it because that's what was causing the problems. Okay, so the new objects is empty. The new list IDs has that value. And so somehow the remove is not working.
I'm gonna go grab some lunch.
Okay.
Go leave.
And see ya.
Does that match?
It may just be Diane because we're not making these strings. So let's do this. I think it's called toString in JavaScript. Let's just see if that helps. So now if I create this list, then you can see the list IDs array. Actually, let's look at the state. List IDs array is that string. The key of the object is that string as well. So that might work better. Nope. Nope,
Yeah.
still. So the new list IDs is not getting set properly. And so deleting a list, when we try to delete the list, okay, so it should be, seems like it should be working. Oops.
Delete list. So it has a number.
Yeah, it's
not a string though.
it looks like it's not a string. And why would it not be? So the lists and our objects, let's see. I mean, the list. Okay, so tried to delete. Actually, can I get that? Hmm. Okay. The ID is there. Okay, 0.146 and then it ends in 197. 0.146 and it ends in 197.
What about that message you had in the console about the list ID not being used?
Oh, is there something up here?
Yeah,
Oh, that's just the list page is not being used in the router. We haven't.
have done that. Okay.
Yeah, that's what that's saying there.
Hmm.
So state.list. Yeah, new list IDs is still showing up with that one value there. Oh, I see. IT is not a list. It is supposed to be a list ID. And so this needs to be that. Right? Because this is a list of IDs. It's not a list of items. So hopefully this should do it for us. Okay.
Keep our fingers crossed. It looks good.
New list IDs is now empty and it's gone. Okay, cool. So yeah, and then so using omit, we can save a lot of space here because that's just saying, give me the object without this key, right? So that's really what we want when we're deleting it. Give me a copy of state.objects that's missing the key that I'm trying to delete here. So yeah, so save that. And delete an item. There's still a problem. Okay, come back over here. Actually, oh, I know why I'm not seeing it. Okay, because I've been doing everything really safely. What happens if I delete a list that still has items on it? Well, I still have a couple of objects. I deleted the list, but then not the objects that were part of it. So if I really wanted to be careful, I would make sure to delete all of the items out of the list as well. You know, right now we've already gone over a little bit, but that's, you know, so what have we done today? We did a little bit of a super fast Lodash tutorial.
Yep.
We then went over kind of how to, you know, how do we do multiple lists? We restructured the state, and we basically did the state of the application turned into this very flat object, right? So list IDs is just a list of IDs. All of our objects are stored in this objects database, and that's the direction that we're going to go when we introduce Redux next time.
Okay.
So what Redux gives us is the ability to have all of our state stored in one place, and it's managed for us. Well, it's kind of managed for us, but it's kind of a structured way of thinking about the state for the overall application. So we'll see if we can Reduxify this thing next time. And one of the benefits of Redux is rather than doing all these print statements, there are actually some Redux developer tools that we can use. And we're not using Redux right now, so it's not showing up. But they'll actually tell you all the things that are in your state. And you can just inspect it and look at all the objects. And every time there's a change in the state, you can see what those changes are. So anyway, something to look forward to next week. Hopefully that's something to look forward to. Any
So
questions? Yeah, go ahead.
your React apps, that's how you manage state is through Redux mainly?
Sometimes. So when you want to have complex state that's stored in the browser, I like to use Redux for some of those things, especially if it's state that's going to show up on multiple pages and you need different views. Because eventually we want to have a page that shows all my lists and a different page for each one of those lists. Right? So if it's multiple pages that are kind of showing the same data in different ways, then that's a case where you might want to think about doing something like a Redux.
Okay. Do you ever find an instance where you're mixing up the functional and the class-based style?
I never use class-based components anymore.
Never.
I use classes, but not for components.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. Very good.
Other questions?
So next week we're going to do some Redux.
That's the object. I was thinking I could get to Redux, but I think putting in multiple lists and flattening out the state made that not achievable in an hour and a half. So I did do flattening out the state might have seemed like kind of a silly thing to do. What it's going to allow us to do a little bit later on is, having state that is simple like this, where the structure is very simple, makes it easy to update as we go. So when we get into Redux, we'll see why that. So if we actually look at this, let's say we don't worry about memory leaks anymore. We're not going to deal with those. What we could do is we could have a little function that would just delete things out of the objects, right? And because that's really, delete list and delete item are very similar to each other, right? The main thing, or a big part of what they do, is they omit things from that objects database. So we could have what we call an action that deletes things out of the state or deletes things out of that objects database. And then we could have another action that, say, updates a list's item IDs or something like that. So these sorts of things can be built into little functions that do a small bit of modification, and that's kind of where Redux is going to be going. And then when we do things like this was kind of an ugly bit of map of code right there. It's basically taking this flat state and then turning it into a nested set of objects that are more convenient for our React. And so what we'll do, what we do normally in Redux is you do write those functions, and we call those functions selectors, because you're selecting things out of the state, and then you're kind of reformatting them into a more convenient way of looking at them. Because the way that, say, Redux is storing things doesn't necessarily match up to the way that your components want to see them, right? And then it turns out, if you do all the work to do that, then hooking it up to an API gets to be really easy. And that's hopefully where we'll eventually get to, is hooking this up with some JSON API. All right?
Yeah.
Other questions?
Yeah, one more question. Your routing, have you used the React Router DOM?
Yeah, that's what I'm doing right here.
I see it, Router DOM. Okay. All right.
I just called it R right there. Yeah.
Gotcha. Very good.
Yep. All right. Well, have a good weekend, everybody, and we'll see you again.